Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us to the live portion of today's program, and welcome to our discussion. My name is Bair-Caruso. I'm part of the Flatirons Food Film Festival board. I'm also with a food company here in town, Boulder, called the Jackfruit Company, and it's a pleasure to be hosting. So yeah, thanks again for joining us, and please remember to use the chat function in your Zoom window to post any questions that you might have for the group pertaining to the movie or to anything that comes up, food waste related. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so discussing the film that we just saw, as well as I just mentioned, food waste and preventing it. We've got a great panel today. With us today, we have Charles McJilton, who is the CEO of Second Harvest Japan. We have Scott Faber of the Environmental Working Group. We've got Leslie Pio of OzHarvest and Hayden Dansky of Boulder Food Rescue. And our discussion will be, our panel will be monitored and run today by Suzanne Jones, who is the Executive Director of EcoCycle and former mayor of beautiful Boulder, Colorado. So Suzanne, take it away and see you guys in a little bit.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Greg. Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to be here. As noted, I'm the Executive Director of EcoCycle. We're a 45-year-old nonprofit social enterprise here in Boulder, Colorado, and we work on recycling, composting, and other zero waste solutions in the service of a more equitable, sustainable, and climate-friendly future. So that's what I do, and I am thrilled to be on this panel with so many wonderful people from around the globe. So I hope everybody got to watch the film, Food Fighter, but let me just briefly frame up the problem that we're going to be talking about, and the issue is food waste. And as noted, that includes, when we talk about food waste, we're talking about for human consumption, and we're talking about food loss that can occur upstream during the growing and the processing phase, as well as food waste downstream when it gets to the retail and the consumption phase. And while exact definitions and amounts could be debated, many say that up to 1/3 of the food that is produced around the globe is wasted. I think here in the United States, it's even a higher number. And at best, I'll note that some people say, well, some food waste is inevitable, right? It's a complex global distribution system. And if you want fresh food that's safe and with lots of consumer choice, you're going to see some waste. But many others, I think most others would argue that 1/3 loss of the food that's produced is horribly inefficient, and some would even say immoral, given that we use so much energy and land and water to produce this food, and it has a huge climate impact. And also because we have so many hungry people in the world, and it seems like there's a horrible disconnect between having so much food wasted and having people that are hungry. So we're going to talk today and have a lively discussion about both the causes and solutions of food waste. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask our wonderful panel here the first question, which is to have each of them give you their 1-minute elevator speech about who their organization is, what its mission is, and some of the most recent outcomes that they're most proud of. And we'll start off with Ronni Kahn, the star of our recent film.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor and a privilege to be with all of you. I started OzHarvest 17 years ago with a purpose to nourish our country, and we do that in 4 ways. We rescue, we educate, we engage, and we innovate. Obviously, rescue is making sure that good food doesn't go to waste. Educate is to make sure that citizens and youth and the whole supply chain understand the value of food, to make sure that good food is preserved in its most important way. Engages us with community, 3,500 volunteers to make sure that the corporates that we work with and innovators to come up with solutions to actually solve some of these major systemic problems and how not to waste food and to make sure that we can shift and change. Thank you. Pleasure to be with you all.
Scott.
Yeah, hi everyone. And first of all, thanks to Ronni for all the amazing work you've done and for the makers of the movie, which was just wonderful to watch. I'm Scott Faber. I work for the Environmental Working Group. We're a national environmental health group. I'm based in Washington, but we have offices all across the country. We have a long history of working on food and farm policy, and in particular, we work on the Farm Bill. That's the bill that Congress takes up every 5 years, and that distributes about $90 billion, 90 billion with a B dollars in annual spending. I also teach I teach a variety of food and farm law classes at Georgetown Law School, and I'm thrilled to be part of this panel.
Excellent. Hayden?
Hey, thanks, y'all, for having me. Yeah, Boulder Food Rescue is a food rescue organization whose mission is to create a more just and less wasteful food system. We're smaller, we're more community-based, and some of the uniqueness in our models is we're completely decentralized. We take food directly from a grocery store to a community, and then we work to bypass barriers to food access. So we go directly to where people are already gathered in the backyards or community rooms of affordable housing sites, preschools, daycares, and we work with residents to basically build, they have their own power to have power and autonomy over their programs. So they're in charge of how everything is run. And there's a number of ways that decreases barriers to access. We focus particularly on produce, the healthier foods, and we are bicycle based. So we do as many shifts as possible by bicycle. And like I said, we're smaller. We have about 150 volunteers that distribute about 1,300 pounds of food every day, and we operate every day of the year. And we see food as a tool to organize, to build trust in our community, so that we can work with communities to enact the solutions they want to see.
Thank you.
And I'm Charles McJilton. I'm the founder of Second Harvest Japan. We're the very first food bank in Japan. Obviously, I'm not Japanese, but you can see I do live in a home that is very Japanese. I've been here for over 30 years, and we began food banking in 2000. And we see our ultimate goal is that people have enough food. And our goal here is to create a new public asset so people have access to the food that they need. Our biggest accomplishment recently was in Okinawa in November. We did not have enough food to distribute to everybody. So we came with an out-of-box solution, asked people to bring food. We did a food drive at a food distribution, which my partner said before I left, good luck with that. 75% of people brought something, and it gave us an opportunity to share with people, to teach an Okinawa saying of yumimaru, to help one another. We came back in December, did the same thing again, and this time 85% of people brought something. And so it was really a new way of people thinking about what would it mean to have access to food and be able to share things with one another. And so I'm very happy here. I met Ronni in 2015 in Bangkok at FEO conference, and I really enjoyed the Food Fighter. I'm glad to be here on the panel today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Pio, and I work for OzHarvest. We're based on the island of Oahu. And we were founded in '99 based on City Harvest, which is in New York City, kind of the OG of a lot of food rescue models. We basically have established the largest network of collaboration between for-business and nonprofit organizations in the state. So annually, we work with about 250 food donors, which, as the others have mentioned, are grocery, wholesale, restaurant, all the way down to like convenience stores. And then 7 days a week, we have refrigerated trucks that same day redistributes that food that we pick up to, over the course of a year, about 175 different nonprofits and social service agencies that then work directly in the communities to distribute the food. And this year, in response to COVID, we scaled up to where on an average year, we redistribute about 1 million pounds of rescued food. This year, we did about 2.5 million pounds of rescued food and worked with 360 food donors as opposed to 250, and added about 100 new recipient agencies that we worked with as well to build out 4 distinct separate programs in addition to food rescue that was really just trying to meet the crazy, a lot of you guys probably saw this, where there was a spike in food waste and a spike in food insecurity at the same time. So it was like, how do we just, meet that right where it is? So really happy to be here with you guys.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. As you can see, we've got a lot of different experts, efforts, and perspectives from around the globe on this topic. So this will be really interesting to dive deep. And we're going to start by talking about the causes. We know there's a lot of food waste and food loss. What do we see, each of you see, as the chief causes of food waste? And what is a realistic goal for trying to reduce waste in such a complex global food system? Ronni, back to you.
So thank you. Given that just last year we saved or diverted around 8.5 million kilos of good food from going to waste, clearly there is a lot of food. I think the simplest answer is it lies, we are the low-hanging fruit, each and every one of us. We've become a very consumptive society. We want everything now, we want it quickly, and we want it 24 hours a day. Our forefathers would go to a market and buy bread, and when the bread was finished, they knew they'd missed out and they'd come back the next day. We want to walk into a supermarket at midnight and have the same choice as we had when we walk in the morning. So we need to be re-educated. So that's in the first instance. Secondly, of course, within the food systems, we have to look at the distribution systems. What do I think is a reasonable amount? Ideally, we all want to minimize food waste so that there is none. I think I've come to terms with the fact that there actually always will be an element, whether it's a tenth or a, I'm not here to throw a number out, but I think each and every one of us has a role in making sure that not only will it save us as households and individuals thousands of dollars, it will save the economy, and that money could be redistributed to other causes.
And why don't I pick up there? And because I think Zan, you mentioned this, but in case you didn't, if food waste was a country, it would be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. Just think about that. The scale of food waste is so great that it would be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases after the US and China. And if we as a planet stopped wasting food altogether, we would eliminate 8% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, most of that food, or the biggest piece of that is lost before the food ever reaches our homes because of the challenges in our distribution channels and poor infrastructure between the field and the first bin. But in a country like the United States, most of that loss occurs after the food reaches our homes. In fact, about 60% of food loss in the US occurs in our homes, which is sadly the worst rate in the world. And as Zan mentioned, experts here in the US at EPA and USDA estimate that about 30% to 40% of our food is wasted. And in real terms, that means we Americans are wasting about 133 billion pounds of food every year, or about $161 billion worth of food, which every year, which is not great. So, so clearly there's a lot of room for improvement. And one reason we should all care is that the food we waste is being dumped in landfills and generating a lot of methane, a greenhouse gas that is 30% more powerful than carbon dioxide. In fact, our landfills are the third largest source of methane emissions in the US, accounting for about 14% of all of our methane emissions. And as Zan mentioned, wasting food also means we cultivate more land. And globally, we cultivate about 5.4 million square miles, not acres, square miles of land, or about 10% of the world's habitable surface to produce food that's never eaten, which is just crazy. So clearly we can do much better, and we are doing better, but there's a lot of room for improvement.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think probably the other panelists can speak to this more than me in terms of global food system. But like my first thoughts in terms of like, what's at the crux of this issue you know, I think about like, and this was spoke about in the movie, consumer demand for perfection and abundance, and those are just being like products of capitalism and the larger systems at play. And when I think about that, I think about like our, as a society, and I know Ronni just spoke to this too, like our disconnection from the resources and the land and place and our food system, and how we're living in an extraction economy and an extraction environment. And so how do we as individuals kind of, and we as a culture, not just as individuals, it's we as a network, that's the individualism is part of that system, right? We as a community, we as a network move towards more of a regenerative economy and a regenerative food system. And there's some really cool work being done around that. And well, we'll save time for the solutions part, I guess. That's it for now.
Great. Charles.
Yes. Okay. So I think, for me, obviously, I think it's a very, complex issue and stuff. And certainly if you even look us up, we said years ago that 1/3 of the food was being wasted. And when you look at the numbers and things like that, different definitions, I find it personally hard to support that. What I do find, though, helpful, and I do think that is to reframe what the problem is that we're out there. I mean, obviously, anybody who sees food being thrown away feels bad about that, right? Because we rely on food to be eaten and stuff. In my estimation, what I see a lot that drives food loss and food waste is choice. That we as consumers, Ronni pointed out, we want to be able to go and have the same food in the morning as in the evening. And we need to rethink, what Hayden pointed out before, is how are we looking at our resources and how are we trying to take care of those resources. And so when I look at the future, I look at what would be more helpful, what I'd like to see in 10 or 20 years with the discussion is not so much we're trying to get to zero waste or how much we are wasting right now, but how is it helping us to reframe and rethink about what we see with the limited resources we have here in the world and stuff. And the other one is to really kind of make peace with the idea that food loss and food waste is a natural byproduct of our system. And unless you want to radically change our system, we're going to have that. For example, I'm a meat eater, but I would find it very difficult to go to a slaughterhouse and see how animals are slaughtered, to be honest with you. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to become vegetarian or that all of us seeing all these pictures of food waste that we're suddenly not going to go to the supermarket and say, I refuse to participate in this. I know here in Japan, we have some of the highest standards of food in the world, and the food that you see being wasted would just, we say if it's not pristine, perfect, or presentable, it doesn't get purchased, and which creates a lot of waste, for people and stuff. But at the same time, we recycle 99% of our food. We don't have the luxury of putting it into a landfill, and there's different ways it's taken care of. So it is a very complex issue, and I'm really engaged when people talk about it. Well, we can look at the future and think about what we can do to limited resources that we have available to us. So I'll pass it on.
Great.
Yeah, I'll just build on, add a little bit to what everyone said. Strongly agree with a lot of the points that everyone raised, especially Ronni and Hayden from my little corner and what I can see. But I think that where I'm at in my process of learning, which is, there's such a wide road ahead. Everyone keeps saying it's so complex. I agree from what I can see, but the essential problem and that drives the systemic issues that then trickle into all the other issues is that we treat food as a commodity and the ultimate end goal of its distribution being profit rather than treating it as an essential need for all people, where its end goal would be feeding people. And so it's actually completely normal and natural if you accept the reality of the way that our system is driven when it's driven by profit, that of course, if a supermarket has food that doesn't get sold, of course they're going to throw it away because the end goal is profit. If it can't produce profit for them, why would they spend extra money and time and resources to get it out, to people who are in need, in the absence of a food rescue organization that will come and say, hey, I'll do this for free. I'll talk you through it. I'll show you, I'll convince you that it's good. All this work that a lot of, I know like Ronni has done in Australia. And so I think just being willing to look that in the eye and saying, we don't treat food as its purpose is to feed people. We treat it as just another commodity in a profit-driven system. So I think that if, to Charles's point about systemic change, like we are all working within a system that is fundamentally flawed. And I think the real change would need to be radical. But for now, we're all doing the work to say that as long as the system exists, because realistically it will probably for a much longer amount of time, it's insane that we would allow all of this to fall through, all this good food to fall through the cracks, rather than doing the work necessary that the for-profit companies won't necessarily do on their own to get it out to where people do have barriers in access, whether it's finances or location.
So it is a big, complex problem and a lot of causes, but thank you for elaborating on some of them. And I think most importantly now is to turn to solutions and what do we do about that? And Scott mentioned some of the environmental impacts that comes with waste. There's also a lot of social impacts. And as we mentioned, a lot of hungry people in the world. And, you know, it seems crazy to be wasting at one end, and could you redistribute it and get it to the folks that are hungry? And what does that look like? 4 out of the 5 of you are engaged in food rescue, food redistribution. So I guess the next question is, what is the role of food rescue and redistribution and food banking, I guess? And, you know, since you guys spend a lot of time doing it, tell us about how does it fit into the solution? And what are other things that we should be doing at the systemic change level to be addressing this huge problem?
Thanks, Suzanne. So for us, we very much work on both sides of this issue daily. There are hungry people and there is good food, and that should get to those people. But there's absolutely no doubt that without systemic change and without education, and that is why education to me is the crux, because it's not only educating industry and business, and as Leslie pointed out, shifting and changing the system. We have to do that concurrently. The reason I say we'll never end food waste is because it is so complex, and there will always be a percentage of vulnerable people. The system has to shift and change. So from our points of view, the education that we deliver is not only to consumers and to citizens on how to value food, because until we value food and understand that it does not cost $1, which you might pay for an apple, but you haven't taken into account the energy, the water, the fuel, the labor that it costs to produce that apple. So our food should be much more expensive, not cheaper. And there, of course, we have supermarkets telling us, price down, cheaper, cheaper, we cheaper. That is killing us. So we have to educate all of us to understand the value of food. We have to educate kids to understand sustainability, how not to waste food, the value of food, because they bring that home into their families. And we have to shift labeling laws, the systems, how we grow food, how much land it takes, as Scott said. I mean, there are solutions, so it's chipping away. It is complex, but we should never absolve ourselves of the responsibility to shift and change the system. And each and every one of us can by just being mindful, apart from, of course, all the big system change that needs to happen. But we can't give up. We have to keep whittling away at all sides of the problem.
And I'll just add that I think if the problem we're trying to solve is hunger, then the first step is expanding our social safety net, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, what used to be called food stamps, and increasing the standard benefit as was just recently done by 15%, recalculating how that benefits recalculating the benefit itself, and ultimately just providing people a living wage. I mean, the reason people go hungry in the United States isn't because there isn't enough food. It's because there are just too many people who can't afford to buy what's available, and we need to make sure that their SNAP benefit goes further, that they have more income. Now, of course, food banks, food rescue organizations are really important partners to SNAP and help supplement the reach of SNAP, and the more we can do to try to expand those programs, the more food we can bring to people. And there has been some change, especially in our cities and counties and states who've really been leading the way. I'm sure if you've watched this movie, you've probably heard about San Francisco and what they've done, but many other cities and all across America are taking steps to rescue food and get it to hungry people. Seattle now composts about half its food waste. New York City runs the largest composting program in the country. So there's a lot of efforts underway to rescue food and get it to hungry people, or divert food waste that wouldn't go to hungry people so that it's not winding up just generating methane in a landfill. And our government, our federal government, has set for itself a goal of cutting food waste by 50% by the year 2030, which is really ambitious. And suffice to say, we didn't make a lot of progress in the last 4 years. But the other thing I just want to quickly mention is the Farm Bill, and the last Farm Bill in particular, which was passed in 2018. And as I mentioned, every 5 years or so, Congress provides about $90 billion a year, which is a lot of money. Most of that goes to SNAP. The balance generally goes in the form of subsidies and farmland stewardship practices to farmers. But what was different about the 2018 Farm Bill is it did include for the first time provisions to address food waste. And they addressed some of the liability issues that Ronni helped us understand in the amazing documentary, and provided, basically a few dollars here and there to start some pilot projects. Overall, about $40 million in a $90 billion a year bill, which is not much, but it's a foothold. And I think it really demonstrates that food waste has really entered the national policy conversation in a way that it really hadn't even 5 years ago, which is really exciting.
It's awesome to jump off of that share. And I was given some snaps. Like before this panel we had there was like an email chain of us talking about these two separate issues and separating it, which I really appreciate that Charles brought that, because I think there are different ways to approach the two different issues. And yeah, my, kind of, I guess, knowledge point is really around food access and hunger, and hunger as a result of economic insecurity, right? Not a lack of food, lack of wages. And so to raise up that piece about a living wage, locally here, a living wage is, for an individual with no children, is $4 an hour more than a minimum wage. And that's if you don't have kids. And so oftentimes where cost of living is higher, if you have different expenses or lack of access to employment, like these barriers just stack up and they compound upon each other. It's not like we can solve each barrier individually even. We can't just put food pantries off of transportation lines, because there's issues with transportation lines and having pantries open during certain hours and stuff. And so I think looking at the issue around the barriers to food access more holistically is going to be really important for that. And a living wage is kind of like a result kind of root cause of some of that issue, because ultimately people want choice, right? Like charitable food is absolutely life-saving, but it's not free. It costs time, it costs emotional burden, it costs shame and stigma. It's really hard to access. And people want to have the same access to choice if they, depending on, like, it doesn't matter what people should make. And so I think we need to look at those systems more in their holistic kind of ways, and use our community building skills, use the trust that we're building to leverage, to use our platform to elevate the voices of people who don't necessarily get those voices. I have so many thoughts. Let me just I also want to kind of like touch on I think reparations and land rights and access to housing is all a big part of the bigger system, like in a US context, but like we are living on stolen land. Land and labor were forcefully taken from people. And I think that has to be a part of the picture. We have policies that disproportionately affect people of color, people with disabilities, people living on low income. And so we need to look at those policies that are still in practice that keep people from having access to those same wages. And I think it's really important for like the nonprofit's role is to challenge the narrative, because unfortunately we haven't made much change in reducing food insecurity. And a lot of the times that's because, and I'm like critique nonprofits a lot, even though like, yeah, what Leslie was saying, we're working within the system to try to change the system. I think it's really important to look at like why we're not speaking up against these things. And a lot of times like the hunger industrial complex, we call it, have funding and influence from the corporations who are paying people terrible wages and then signing their employees up for food stamps. We need to look at that and we need to challenge that. I'm probably speaking too much, so I'm going to stop.
Well, it's good stuff, but we'll let some other folks in too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hayden. I appreciate those comments. So it reminds me when I was a kid and growing up and in the 70s, and I left some food on my table. My mom's like, "Hey, there's starving babies in Africa. You got to send it." And I said, "Well, geez, can you send this to them?" And she's like, basically, slapped me upside the head. "You can't do that." And I really understand, the emotional feeling people have when they think of waste and people that are in need. And that's a visceral connection that we have, and a natural one. But these are really two separate issues and need to be framed, separately and differently. And, my concern always is when they get tied together, and particularly when politicians put forth laws that say, "Hey, let's reduce liability. You're covering liability." The reality is that the company can be covered by liability, but they're still not going to donate because they're concerned about the branding of the product. Meaning they may prevail in the court, but in the court of public opinion, they're still going to take a hit. And so when I hear politicians and actors saying we need to have laws to protect donors, I go, that is not the problem. The problem is trust, right? That's part of the issue right there. We had a law that went into effect a year and a half ago here in Japan to reduce food loss, food waste. Of course, everybody likes that. The unintended consequences, we saw a dramatic decrease in the amount of food that was coming to us because it opened up different markets for these donors. On the other side of the coin here is access to food. And I think there is a valuable critique of the limitations of charitable organizations like ourselves to provide food security for people. I've just been going through a really good book called Food Bank Nations. It's a very good book that critiques that. My interest in critiquing my own work, and I think the work that we do, is to say, what can we do better? How can we see the situation from a different point of view? And if, food security is about access to food, are we the best? Are we the best way to go about this? And, how we frame this, because we're pioneers in our field here in Japan, which has never been done before. There's a lot of talk about food loss and food waste here in Japan, but almost zero about food security. And so our focus is thinking people as a new public asset, that we as a community can come together and create this new public asset like a library where people can come and do things. And that's where, again, we had this out of box idea in Okinawa last month to let's do a food drive there. Again, I'm an American, and you could say you're gonna do a food drive at a food pantry, but the knock-on benefits for both the person who are participating and for us who are doing it was dramatic, in the sense that it's like we're all in this together. And when you teach a little cute girl who puts her can there and says, "Why am I doing this?" And you explain the Okinawa phrase, "Yuimaru," where you're helping one another. I says, "You're gonna help another family." She turns to her mom and says, "Mom, you are really, really kind." If you're a parent, to get an unprovoked compliment from your child, you know what that means. And it changes the dynamics of what this means. And so that's what we're trying to do here, is to trying to reframe what is the actual issue here of getting access to people, to food, to create a new public asset, and to kind of thinking about it from a different perspective. So I'm really interested when people talk about, let's kind of separate these two issues here and not say that emotionally, yes, they're connected, but realistically, both the causes and the responses need to be thought about differently.
Thank you, Charles. Leslie?
I'll just speak to two big things that stuck out to me from what everyone said. Yeah, I really agree with the conversation keeps coming up of the way that individuals affect the broader culture, which then informs systemic change, and then the way that affects individuals, you know, as a circle. And something that I think, well, really amongst what all of everyone was saying was the way that to me it stuck out so much during the pandemic this past year and continuing into this one, how the blanket was kind of pulled back on how much society already relies on nonprofits and social service agencies that are not receiving anywhere near the level of government support that they should be receiving for the services that they provide. You know, and it was just one little push, and then it was like, oh my God, the skeleton is revealed, and it's like, why is there no support, you know, for these people who are actually on the ground in the communities who would then have the on the ground knowledge to address things like food security in the ways necessary to each specific area, because there's different concerns with each area. For example, in Hawaii, we incinerate a lot of our food waste. So the whole environmental conversation is a little bit different. It still produces toxic ash, but we incinerate about 80% of our food waste, and only about 20% sits in a landfill and produces methane. So there's just a different conversation that needs to happen there. But what it makes me think is that I know we all know about the 96 Good Samaritan law that was passed by the US federal government that, yeah, basically encourages, right, businesses to give without liability. And as we all know, businesses are still scared, especially the big ones, especially the ones that are multi-million-dollar, you know, like huge resorts and hotels, which are often the worst offenders of food waste. And I just feel like laws like that are good, but until there's more marriage and connection between like the federal government and then smaller agencies on the ground in these communities, and financial and legislative support, I don't see how there will be ever much momentum of just these broad sweeping gestures on the federal level to actually have much impact on states and cities. And I'll just add one last thought, which is that the power of the individual, again, within this consumer society is, I think, very real. And as people do become more educated, as Ronni keeps talking about, and as they do get to sort of even have a choice to decide what they value, because a lot of people, until they know about food waste, don't even have the choice to say, like, I'd rather put my money here, right? Or I'd rather shop it somewhere like maybe Whole Foods, where, you know, they've created a whole program to basically redistribute most of their food waste. So the more education that happens, then within this consumer-driven society, what the consumer values can change, and they can make the decision if they have the financial means to support things that will push us toward less food waste. Whereas if that education isn't there, that choice can't be made.
So we have time for one more question. This one's got to be a little bit more of a lightning round, but thank you guys for sort of peeling back the onion and going deep on this issue. I think it's very enlightening. The Food Fighter film and Ronnie's life, I think, really focused on the role of activism and her role in particular. And it's very inspiring. And a lot of people watching also want to know, in addition to changing the system, what can I do? What should I do? And so that's my last question to you is, how do you answer that question when people say, hey, what can I do? And they'll have to be shorter answers. Ronni, go. And tell us about your new book, Ronni.
Awesome. Read my book, because it also talks about the responsibility each and every one of us have, not in a nasty way, but just sharing how we can shift and change. I want to remind each and every one of us, governments, officials, supermarkets, major corporate leaders are individuals, they're humans. Each and every one of us has the power to make this change. So the most important thing is we have a new mantra: look, buy, store, cook. That's what each and every one of us can do. Look what's in your fridge, look what's in your pantry, make a shopping list before you go shopping. Buy what you need. Store it so that it lasts and you preserve it the most, and cook your food, use leftovers. And that mantra will not only save you thousands of dollars, but it is ultimately going to affect our planet. That is what each and every one of us can do, whether you're the CEO of a business or whether you are an individual. The supermarket CEOs tell me all the time, we buy cherries that are out of season, that we walk into the store, they will have cherries on their shelf. If we don't buy them, they won't sell them. So every single one of us has the power to make tiny shifts. Look, buy, store, cook. Go for it. And read my book, A Repurposed Life.
Read Ronnie's book. That would be the first thing I would say. And I think, you know, I'll leave it to others to talk about what we should all be doing in our homes, but call if you're in Boulder, call Congressman Neguse, who's a real great newer member of Congress, a great leader. Invite him to visit your food rescue organization. He would love to do that. Call Senator Bennett, who's on the Senate Agriculture Committee and will help write the next farm bill, and tell him to make hunger and food banking and food rescue organizations a priority. Call Ed Case if you're in Hawaii. He's a great congressman as well. So they'll never hear about these stories if you don't share them. So it's important to take the time to do that.
Okay, Hayden, real quick, what's your advice?
There's a resource called savethefood.com that can help take you through how to change food waste in your own home. Financially support or volunteer at your local organization. Vote. Challenge poverty narratives. Challenge the narratives that you're hearing that people should have worked harder or should be grateful for what they get. Also challenge the narratives about climate change and the effects of food waste being something in the future or something that doesn't affect us. And then do your own internal work of unlearning those narratives as well.
Well, Hayden,
Thank you for that.
Hayden, you pretty much said what I was going to say, that, you know, first educate yourself, but also I would think is to kind of redefine yourself. What do you think your relationship is to the community, and what can you offer to the community? Sometimes I think we think that the problem's much bigger than what we can do and stuff. And as Ronnie said, we all have a role to play. And I would also echo too what Ronnie said. These are people. These are people. We have a shared concern for the future, and to think about what we want the world to look like in 10, 15, 20 years. And that each one of us really can play a role to shape that. You know, I'm a foreigner here in Japan, and yet I've been able to do that, and that continue to, you know, inform me and what I do. So that would be my biggest thing to people to say.
Leslie, take us home.
Support food rescue in your area. Find out if it exists. If so, if you can give your time or your money. Food rescue can always use support rather than maybe buying canned goods and, you know, doing that route. Support just getting food that already exists out to those who need it. Everywhere you go that is a food business, if you have the energy, ask about what happens to excess unused food. If you're out to eat, ask your server, like, hey, I was just curious, like if you guys have excess stuff in the back at the end of the month, like what happens to that? You know, and maybe don't harass your server, but it's actually possible, right? Like ask to talk to the chef, start these conversations. If you're grocery shopping, ask to speak to the floor manager and say, hey, I'm just curious what happens to the milk that's 3 days out from going, like, what do you guys do with that? And just starting those conversations, again, yeah, reaching out to your representatives, but at every level, the more people who are educated and asking, and you don't have to be malicious, just asking, it increases the general awareness that this is something people care about. And so if I want to continue to do well and have my customers trust, I need to shift the way that I do this. And lastly, what did I scribble down? Lastly, just be aware of, like, I might butcher the statistic. I think it's something like 40% of food loss waste at the consumer level in the US is due to confusion over labels about best by or expires by. And so just take a moment to realize those are non-standardized labels. If you have yogurt that expired the day before, you don't need to throw it out. Like, you know, just smell it, taste a little bit, and that's just a big way, right? Like, even if it passes those labels, just recognize those labels really just exist to protect companies from overly being scared of some kind of lawsuit more than it has anything to do with food safety. And that's a recognized fact. You know, you can trust that.
Suzanne, can I say one little thing? When you go to your business, instead of saying, what do you do with your food waste? Say, I'm sure you never had food waste, but if you did, and I'll tell you why. People get defensive. They don't want to admit that they've ever got food waste. So if you say, I'm sure you never had food waste, but what if you did? Do you know you could call this organization or that, or you could give it? It shifts people's mindsets. The next day they call us. But it's people always defend themselves. Oh, we don't waste. We're the most efficient business in the world.
Hey,
And
Ronni, can you show us your book one more time? Just so
oh, thank you, darling. It's called A Repurposed Life. A repurposed life. And really the purpose is that each and every one of us can understand that there is a role for us to play. I am not unique. I'm not special. I'm not ordinary. I just took action, and all of us can do that, really.
Well, what a note to end on. Thank you all for the work you do, for being so articulate and sharing that wisdom with all of us. So we are thrilled to be a part of this with you. And let me hand it over to Greg.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to our panel. That was great stuff. It was inspiring and like touching. So thanks a lot, guys. Also, Ronni, I have to say, I'm sorry that I didn't introduce you before handing it over to Suzanne at the beginning. As soon as I realized that I didn't do that, I had already handed over, and I'm embarrassed. I apologize. So thanks again for being part of this. To our audience and guests, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Please remember to follow us on your favorite social media platforms. We're there. You can find us very easily. And of course, as a nonprofit film festival, we would love your financial support, no matter the amount. So please visit us at flatironsfoodfilmfest.org to see what you can do to donate if possible, and also to check out the rest of our schedule. We've got some great programs coming up over the next 5 days or so here through next Friday. And we'd love to host you again during this year's festival. So in the meantime, remember, look, buy, store, and cook, and let's try to make a little bit of a difference where we can, and feel good about that. So thanks, everybody. Have a great Sunday and a great week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you all. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.